Your brain thinks you're being hunted, but the predator is actually your empty apartment. In high-density cities, your amygdala is misfiring, interpreting modern social isolation as lethal physical threat. We're diving into the neurological glitch where urban silence triggers the same cortisol spikes as the predator in the wild. There has never been a time in human history where people have lived this close together and felt this far apart. In 2026, millions of people wake up every morning stacked vertically in glass towers, surrounded by thousands of other lives, separated only by thin walls, elevators, and shared air. Cities pulse with movement, noise, and density. You can step outside and be within arm's reach of more human beings than your ancestors would encounter in an entire lifetime. And yet, something deeply unsettling is happening beneath the surface. Despite this unprecedented proximity, rates of perceived loneliness and social isolation are at historic highs, not just among the elderly or the socially withdrawn, but across all age groups, including young, digitally connected populations. People are not physically alone, but they feel alone in a way that is more existential than situational. This is the paradox of the modern city. You're surrounded but not seen, connected but not known, and your brain doesn't understand the difference. For over 99% of human history, survival depended on one thing above almost everything else: belonging to a group. To be separated from your tribe was not just uncomfortable, it was a death sentence. Alone, you were vulnerable to predators. You had no one to share resources with, no protection while you slept, no backup if you were injured. Isolation meant exposure, and exposure meant risk. The human brain evolved under these conditions, wiring itself to treat social disconnection as a direct threat to survival. Fast forward to today, and the environment has changed faster than our biology. Now, a person can spend an entire weekend alone in a high-rise apartment, safe behind locked doors, climate-controlled walls, and endless digital entertainment. No predators, no immediate physical danger, no scarcity of food or water. But the brain doesn't register it that way. Instead, it runs an ancient script. It interprets that silence, that lack of human contact, as something deeply wrong. As if the tribe has moved on without you. As if you've been left behind. What you are experiencing is not just boredom or sadness. It's a neurological misfire. When the brain perceives social isolation, it activates many of the same systems it would use in a life-threatening situation. Stress hormones begin to rise. Cortisol levels increase. Your body shifts into a low-grade state of vigilance. You may not consciously feel in danger, but your physiology tells a different story. This is why prolonged loneliness doesn't just feel bad, it feels urgent. There is a subtle but persistent sense that something is off. A background anxiety, a feeling that you should be doing something, going somewhere, fixing something, even if you can't quite name what it is. For some people, this escalates into a more intense experience. A quiet apartment starts to feel oppressive. Time slows down. Thoughts become louder. Small worries expand to larger ones. The mind, deprived of social grounding, begins to turn inward, sometimes spiraling into rumination or dread. This is not weakness. This is your brain doing exactly what it was designed to do, just in the wrong environment. Here is the contradiction that defines modern loneliness. You are physically safe, but your brain does not feel secure. Security in evolutionary terms was never just about shelter or food. It was about proximity to others, the presence of familiar voices, the rhythm of shared activity, the subtle constant reassurance that you were not alone in the world. Modern urban life has stripped much of that away. You can go days without meaningful conversation, weeks without physical touch, months without feeling truly known by another person. And all the while, your brain is quietly asking a question it has asked for tens of thousands of years. Where is everyone? This is where the experience becomes especially unsettling. Many people living in these conditions report a vague but persistent sense of unease, not tied to any specific threat, but present nonetheless. A feeling that something bad is about to happen, that something isn't right. In the past, that feeling would have been incredibly useful. It would have pushed you to seek out your group, to re-establish connection, to reduce your vulnerability. But in a modern city, there is no clear action to take. You can scroll, you can text, you can consume content, but none of these fully resolve the underlying signal your brain is sending. So the signal lingers. What you are left with is a strange psychological state, a constant low-level sense of danger in an environment that is objectively safe. This is the ghost in the high-rise. Not a literal presence, but an evolutionary echo. A system designed for a world that no longer exists, still running in the background of your daily life. It's why a crowded subway can feel isolating, why a weekend alone can feel heavier than it should, why digital connection rarely satisfies in the same way as physical presence. And most importantly, it's why so many people today feel like something is missing, even when on paper everything is fine. Because to your brain, something is definitely missing. Not safety, not resources, but people. And until that ancient system is understood, modern loneliness will continue to feel less like a mood and more like a quiet, persistent warning that you've been left behind. If loneliness is the signal, the amygdala is the siren. Buried deep within the brain, the amygdala functions as a rapid response threat detector. It does not debate, analyze, or wait for evidence. Its job is simple. Scan the environment for danger and, if anything feels off, sound the alarm. For most of human history, this system worked remarkably well. A rustle in the bushes, a sudden silence in the group, a missing member of the tribe. These were not abstract concerns. They were potential signs of immediate danger. The amygdala evolved to treat uncertainty, isolation, and social disruption as serious threats, because in the wild, they often were. But in the modern world, the threats have changed. The amygdala hasn't. In today's urban environment, the signals that reach the brain are radically different from those our ancestors evolved to interpret. You wake up in an apartment, no voices, no eye contact, no shared activity. You check your phone, scroll through updates, maybe exchange a few messages. But there is no physical presence, no real-time feedback from other human beings. To the conscious mind, this is normal. To the amygdala, it's suspicious. The absence of eye contact, facial expressions, tone of voice, and physical proximity creates a kind of sensory void. And the brain is not designed to interpret voids as neutral. It interprets them as potential threats. Eye contact, in particular, plays a powerful regulatory role. It signals safety, connection, and mutual awareness. When it's missing, the brain loses one of the most reliable indicators that everything is okay. So the amygdala begins to fill in the blanks, and it rarely fills them in optimistically. Here is where the system begins to misfire in a profound way. In ancestral environments, being socially excluded meant something very specific. You were no longer protected by the group. You were exposed to predators, to the elements, to injury without support. Social exclusion wasn't just emotional pain. It was a direct increase in mortality risk. The brain encoded this reality deeply. So deeply, in fact, that it still treats social exclusion as a form of physical danger. When modern individuals experience isolation, whether it's being ignored, spending long periods alone, or lacking meaningful interaction, the amygdala can interpret this as a signal that you're no longer inside the tribe. And if you're outside the tribe, you're vulnerable. Not metaphorically, literally in the language of the brain. The result is a cascade of physiological responses. The stress system activates, vigilance increases, the body prepares, subtly but persistently for a threat that never fully arrives. This is not a conscious belief. You don't think, I'm going to die because I didn't talk to anyone today. But your nervous system behaves as if something is wrong. One of the most disorienting aspects of this process is that the anxiety it produces often lacks a clear object. In traditional danger scenarios, fear has a focus, a predator, a threat, a specific risk that can be identified and responded to. But in cases of modern loneliness, the threat is abstract. There is no visible danger in the room, no immediate problem to solve, no clear action to take. And yet, the body remains on alert. This creates a state of free-floating anxiety where the mind begins searching for something to justify the feeling. Small concerns become magnified. Neutral situations are interpreted more negatively. The brain, trying to make sense of the internal alarm, starts to construct narratives around it. Something's wrong. I'm falling behind. I'm not where I should be. I'm missing something. These thoughts are not random. They are attempts to explain a signal that originated in a much older part of the brain. This dynamic is especially pronounced in major urban and tech-driven environments. Cities that are hubs of innovation, productivity, and digital connectivity. Places designed for efficiency and opportunity often produce some of the highest reported levels of loneliness. Why? Because these environments maximize interaction, but often minimize connection. You can go through an entire day in a place like San Francisco, New York, or London, surrounded by people, yet experience almost no meaningful social engagement. Conversations are transactional, eye contact is brief or avoided. Everyone is moving quickly, focused on their own objectives. From the outside, it looks like constant activity, but from the inside, it can feel like isolation in motion. For the amygdala, this is a confusing and destabilizing environment. The presence of people suggests safety, but the lack of connection suggests exclusion. The signals are mixed, and when the brain receives mixed signals, it tends to err on the side of caution, which means assume risk. Over time, this misinterpretation becomes chronic. The amygdala doesn't just activate once, it stays partially engaged. The baseline level of alertness rises. The nervous system becomes calibrated to a slightly elevated state of stress, even in the absence of immediate danger. This is what many people now recognize as the background hum of modern anxiety. It's not panic, it's not acute fear. It's a constant low-level tension that never fully turns off. You feel it in the need to check your phone, in the discomfort of silence, in the urge to distract yourself, to fill the space, to avoid being alone with your thoughts. Because when the external world goes quiet, the internal alarm becomes more noticeable. The tragedy of this system is that it is trying to protect you. The amygdala is not malfunctioning in the sense of being broken. It is functioning exactly as it was designed to function, responding to signals of potential vulnerability. The problem is that the signals themselves have changed. Modern loneliness sends the same cues that once indicated real danger, but in a context where those cues no longer carry the same meaning. So the brain overreacts, and the body pays the price. Chronic stress, elevated anxiety, difficulty relaxing, a persistent sense that something is wrong, even when everything appears fine. This is what it means for the amygdala to be under siege, not by an external force, but by a mismatch between ancient wiring and modern life. There is no predator outside your apartment door, no immediate threat in your environment, no tangible danger in your surroundings. Because in its language, there is only one explanation for prolonged disconnection: you are alone. And alone in the world it was built for meant you are in danger. That ancient assumption still lives inside you. And in the silence of modern life, it speaks louder than ever. Modern cities were built to solve problems of space, efficiency, and scale. They were not built for the nervous system. Steel, glass, concrete, and climate-controlled interiors have created environments that are structurally impressive, but biologically confusing. From the outside, they represent progress. From the inside, they often function as something closer to controlled isolation chambers, quietly amplifying the very stress responses they were meant to eliminate. And at the center of this response is cortisol. To the conscious mind, a high-rise apartment is a symbol of safety and success. It protects you from weather, crime, and environmental threats. It offers privacy, control, and convenience. But the body does not interpret environments symbolically. It interprets them sensorially. And in that sense, modern architecture strips away many of the cues the nervous system relies on to regulate itself. Natural environments are rich with subtle signals. The movement of leaves, variations in light, distant sounds, shifting air, and the presence of other living beings. These outputs provide a constant stream of information that helps the brain calibrate its sense of safety. In contrast, steel and glass environments are often static and silent. The hair doesn't move unless mechanically controlled. The lighting is artificial and unchanging. The sounds are muted or distant. Even the walls themselves block the subtle social cues. Footsteps, voices, shared activity that would normally signal the presence of others. What you're left with is a kind of sensory reduction. Not complete deprivation, but enough to create ambiguity. And the brain does not like ambiguity. In uncertain environments, the brain defaults to caution. The amygdala, already sensitive to signs of social presence, feeds into the body's stress system, triggering the release of cortisol. This hormone is designed to help you respond to threats, increasing alertness, mobilizing energy, and preparing the body for action. In short bursts, cortisol is useful. But modern environments don't trigger short bursts. They create low-grade, sustained activation. You are not running from danger. You're sitting in a quiet apartment, scrolling, thinking, existing in a space that lacks the signals your brain expects. There is no clear threat, but there is also no clear reassurance. So the system stays partially engaged. Cortisol levels don't spike dramatically, they hover, and that hovering state becomes the baseline. This is where the concept of crowded isolation becomes critical. In traditional isolation, you are physically alone, separated from others. In modern cities, the situation is more complex. You're physically surrounded by people, but socially disconnected from them. You share walls, elevators, hallways, and public spaces with hundreds of thousands of individuals you do not know, do not speak to, and may never interact with. From a biological perspective, this creates a contradiction. Presence suggests safety, disconnection suggests risk. The nervous system struggles to reconcile these signals. You hear movement around you, footsteps in the hallway, voices through the walls, but there is no relationship attached to them. No familiarity, no recognition, no shared identity. To the brain, this can feel less like community and more like unresolved uncertainty. Who are these people? Are they safe? Do they know you? Will they help you if something went wrong? There are no answers. And in the absence of answers, the brain leans towards vigilance. Once this state sets in, it begins to reinforce itself. Elevated cortisol increases alertness, but it also heightens sensitivity to potential threats. You become more aware of small disturbances, more reactive to ambiguity, more likely to interpret neutral stimuli as negative. A noise in the hallway becomes suspicious. A lack of messages becomes rejection. Silence becomes discomfort. This heightened sensitivity feeds back into the stress system, maintaining or increasing cortisol levels. And so, a loop is created. Isolation, uncertainty, cortisol, hyper-awareness, more perceived isolation. The body is not just reacting to the environment, it is amplifying it. Over time, this loop becomes self-sustaining. Perhaps the most paradoxical outcome of this system is the experience of hypervigilance in densely populated environments. You can walk through a crowded street, ride a packed subway, or sit in a busy cafe and still feel on edge. Not because of any specific threat, but because the nervous system has not registered these people as part of your group. They are present, but not integrated. Your brain does not categorize them as allies or even as known quantities. They remain neutral at best, ambiguous at worst. And ambiguity keeps the system alert. This is why many people report feeling more relaxed in smaller familiar settings, even if these environments are objectively less secure. A quiet neighborhood, a friend's home, a place where faces are recognized and interactions are predictable. provides something the modern city often does not: relational certainty. Without that certainty, the nervous system never fully powers down. Sustained cortisol exposure has real consequences. It affects sleep, making it harder to fully rest even when you're physically tired. It impacts mood, contributing to irritability, anxiety, and emotional fatigue. It influences cognition, narrowing focus and increasing the tendency toward negative thinking. But perhaps most importantly, it reinforces the very condition that triggered it. High cortisol makes social engagement feel more effortful. It reduces the motivation to reach out, to initiate interaction, to break the cycle of isolation. So people withdraw further, which increases isolation, which sustains the loop. Modern architecture excels at optimizing space, movement, and privacy. But in doing so, it often removes the incidental interactions that once formed the fabric of daily social life. The casual conversations, the shared routines, the repeated exposure to familiar faces. These small moments acted as continuous signals of belonging. They told the brain over and over again, you're part of something. In their absence, the brain is left to interpret silence. And silence, in evolutionary terms, really meant safety. The cortisol loop of modern architecture is not the result of a single failure. It is the outcome of a system that has outpaced the biology it operates within. We have built environments that protect the body but confuse the brain. Spaces that maximize efficiency but minimize the signals of connection that regulate our stress response. And so, the nervous system remains in a state of quiet readiness, not panicked, not overwhelmed, but never fully at ease, waiting in the background for a signal that resolves the ambiguity, a voice, a face, a moment of recognition, something that tells the system what it has been trying to confirm all along: you are not alone. The human brain is not designed for the world we've built. It is designed for a world that no longer exists. For roughly 50,000 years, human beings lived in small, tightly bonded groups. Social interaction was not optional. It was constant, embodied, and unavoidable. You woke up next to people, moved with them, walked with them, ate with them, and rested in their presence. Your identity, safety, and survival were inseparable from the group. Then, in the span of a few decades, everything changed. The mid-2020s introduced a social environment that is not just new, but fundamentally incompatible with the system that governs human behavior. Communication became digital, interaction became optional, and presence became abstract. The hardware stayed the same, the input did not. The modern social world is dominated by screens, messages, notifications, and curated representations of other people's lives. These signals mimic social interaction, but they do not fully replicate it. A text message carries information, but not tone. A social media post conveys presence, but not reciprocity. A video call simulates connection, but lacks physical co-presence. To the conscious mind, these substitutes often feel sufficient. To the deeper systems of the brain, they are incomplete. The brain evolved to read micro-expressions, body language, subtle shifts in posture, timing of speech, physical proximity, and shared environmental context. These cues are not extras, they are the primary language of human connection. When they are missing, the brain struggles to fully register the interaction is real. So, even after hours of digital engagement, something still feels unresolved. The system has been simulated but not satisfied. When the brain detects prolonged social disconnection, it does not remain passive, it adapts. But the adaptations it produces are not always helpful in a modern context. They are survival behaviors designed for a different environment, and when deployed in today's world, they often make the situation worse. One of the most common responses is irritability. When the nervous system is under chronic stress, tolerance decreases. Small inconveniences feel larger. Minor frustrations trigger outsized reactions. This is not simply a personality issue, it's a nervous system under strain, conserving energy and reacting quickly to perceived threats. Another response is social withdrawal. At first glance, this seems counterintuitive. If loneliness is the problem, why would the brain push toward isolation? But from an evolutionary standpoint, withdrawal can serve as a protective mechanism. If the environment feels unsafe or uncertain, Reducing exposure can lower risk. In ancestral conditions, this might have meant staying close to a shelter or avoiding unknown groups. In the modern world, it often looks like cancelling plans, avoiding calls, or retreating further into digital spaces. And here is where the cycle tightens. Loneliness triggers stress. Stress triggers withdrawal. Withdrawal increases isolation. The system begins to feed itself. Another subtle but powerful shift occurs in how individuals perceive social interactions. When the brain is operating in a heightened state of alertness, it becomes more sensitive to potential signs of rejection or exclusion. Neutral expressions can be interpreted as negative. Delayed responses feel intentional. Silence takes on meaning. This is not paranoia in the clinical sense. It is the brain scanning for signals that confirm its underlying assumption that something is wrong socially. In small, close-knit groups, this sensitivity would have been adaptive. It will allow individuals to quickly detect and repair social fractures before they escalated. But in large, impersonal environments, it often leads to misinterpretation. People begin to feel excluded even when no exclusion is intended. And that perception reinforces the sense of disconnection. All of these processes carry a cost. Maintaining a heightened state of awareness requires energy. The stress system, driven by cortisol and other hormones, is metabolically demanding. It keeps the body prepared, but preparation is not free. Over time, this constant low-level activation begins to drain resources. People describe it as fatigue, but not the kind that comes from physical exertion. It is a deeper exhaustion, one that sleep does not fully resolve. A sense of being worn down without a clear cause. This is a systemic burnout at the biological level. Not just mental fatigue, but a body that has been operating in a semi-defensive state for too long. The effects of this prolonged stress extend beyond mood and energy. The immune system is closely linked to the body's stress response. In short bursts, stress can enhance immune function, but when stress becomes chronic, the effect reverses. Elevated cortisol over long periods suppresses immune activity. The body, prioritizing immediate survival over long-term maintenance, relocates resources. Systems that are not deemed urgent, such as immune defense, begin to downregulate. This is why chronic loneliness has been associated with increased susceptibility to illness, slower recovery times, and a general decline in physical resilience. The body is not failing randomly. It is responding to a signal that, in its original context, would have required a different kind of adaptation. At the core of this entire process is a conflict between two realities. Externally, you may be safe. You may have access to resources, technology, and opportunities that far exceed anything available to previous generations. Internally, your brain is operating as if something critical is missing, because from its perspective, it is. The signals of belonging, proximity, and shared existence that once defined human life have been fragmented, digitized, or removed altogether. And the brain has no updated model to replace them, so it continues to run the old one. This is what makes modern loneliness so uniquely exhausting. It is not just the absence of connection, it is the constant effort of a biological system trying and failing to reconcile its expectations with reality. You reach out, but the interaction feels incomplete. You withdraw, but the isolation intensifies. You rest, but the underlying tension remains. There is no clear resolution, only a loop of adaptation and misadaptation, each response feeding into the next. In traditional models, burnout is often attributed to overwork, stress, or lack of rest. But in the context of modern loneliness, burnout can emerge even in the absence of these factors. It is the result of chronic internal contradiction. A brain that expects connection, operating in an environment that provides fragments of it. A body that prepares for threat, without a threat to resolve. A system that remains active, without closure. Over time, that unresolved activation becomes exhaustion. Not dramatic, not sudden, but persistent, and deeply rooted in a mismatch that modern life has yet to solve.
I'm so glad they finally finished this renovation.
It's incredible, isn't it? The view from up here is stunning.
If modern loneliness is the result of a mismatch, then the solution is not to abandon the modern world. It is to translate it back into a language the brain understands. The nervous system is not asking for perfection, it is asking for signals. Small, consistent cues that say you are not alone, you are part of something, you are safe. The problem is not that these signals are impossible to create in modern cities, it's that they are no longer automatic, so they must become intentional. For most of human history, safety was not something you thought about. It was something you felt, constantly reinforced through proximity to others. In modern urban life, that reinforcement is largely absent, but it can be rebuilt, not through massive lifestyle overhauls, but through small-scale biological interventions, not abstract ideas, practical, repeatable behaviors that directly target the nervous system. One of the most powerful of these is the creation of micro-communities. Not large networks, not thousands of followers, but small, consistent groups of people who interact regularly in real space. A weekly gathering, a shared activity, a predictable rhythm of contact. The size matters less than the consistency. The brain does not need to know hundreds of people. It needs to recognize a few. Familiar faces reduce uncertainty. Repetition builds trust. Over time, these interactions begin to re-establish the sense of belonging that the nervous system is searching for. Closely related communities is the concept of thought spaces. These are environments that are neither home nor work. Places where people gather without a specific transactional purpose. Cafes, parks, gyms, community centers, local shops, spaces where presence is shared, even without direct interaction. In traditional societies, these spaces were everywhere. In modern societies, they still exist, but they are often underutilized or replaced by purely functional environments. The difference is subtle but important. A place where people simply coexist, where you see the same faces, hear the same voices, and become a part of a familiar rhythm, sends a powerful signal to the brain. This is your environment, these are your people. Even minimal interaction, a nod, a brief exchange, a moment of recognition can be enough to lower the baseline level of vigilance, because the brain begins to map the space as known rather than ambiguous. Understanding underlying mechanism of loneliness changes how it can be addressed. If the feeling of isolation is partly the result of a neurological misinterpretation, then it becomes possible to bypass it intentionally, not by suppressing it, but by responding to it with the right inputs. When the brain signals discomfort, the instinct may be to withdraw, to stay in, to avoid effort. But that instinct is part of the loop. Breaking the loop requires doing something that may feel unnatural in the moment. Moving toward connection, even in small ways. A short conversation, a shared activity, time spent in a space where other people are present and familiar. These actions may seem insignificant at the conscious level, but at the level of the nervous system, they are corrective signals. They tell the brain that the initial interpretation was incomplete, that you are not, in fact, outside the group. Over time, repeated exposure to these signals begin to recalibrate the system. The amygdala becomes less reactive. Cortisol levels stabilize. The baseline sense of threat decreases. Not because the environment has changed dramatically, but because the brain has received enough evidence to update its assumptions. The shift from loneliness to connection does not require constant social activity. It requires cohesion, a sense that you're embedded in a network of relationships, even if those relationships are few. This is where intentionality becomes critical. In a world where connection is optional, it must be chosen, not once, but repeatedly. This does not mean forcing extroversion or constant engagement. It means creating structures that support regular contact, standing plans, recurring interactions, spaces where attendance becomes part of a routine rather than a decision. These structures reduce the friction of connection, making it easier for the brain to receive the signals it needs without constant effort. At a larger scale, this understanding points toward a different vision for urban design, one that prioritizes not just efficiency but biological compatibility. Cities have historically been designed around movement, economics, and density, but as the psychological costs of modern living become more apparent, there is a growing recognition that human well-being must be built into the structure of the environment itself. This could take many forms. Spaces that encourage lingering rather than passing through. Neighborhood designs that increase repeated exposure to the same individuals. Public areas that facilitate low-stake interaction rather than purely functional use. Architectural choices that incorporate natural elements and sensory variation. The goal is not to recreate the past, it is to integrate the needs of the human nervous system into the present. At its core, the problem of modern loneliness is not just emotional, it is biological. A system designed to detect danger is being triggered by the absence of connection, and in the absence of corrective signals, it continues to run. But the system is also adaptable. It can learn. Given the right input, it can recalibrate. The survival alarm that once signaled isolation can be quieted, not through distraction or denial, but through real embodied connection, even at a small scale. A conversation, a shared space, a familiar face. These are not trivial experiences. They are the signals that tell your brain the most important thing it can know. You're not alone. And once that message is received consistently and clear, the system begins to shift. The tension softens, the vigilance fades, the background noise of unease starts to disappear. Not all at once, but enough to remind you that the feeling of danger was never about the city itself. It was about the absence of connection within it. And that, unlike the architecture, is something that can be rebuilt. If you or someone you love is struggling with addiction, it is time to take back control, one step at a time. My book, The Ultimate Guide to Overcoming Addiction, Steps to Resources, is your complete roadmap to recovery. Inside, you'll find practical strategies, proven tools, and the emotional support you need to break free from destructive habits for good. This isn't just another self-help manual. It's a companion for your comeback. Written to empower, educate, and guide you through the science, psychology, and real-world process of healing. Whether you are just starting your recovery journey or looking to strengthen your progress, this guide will show you how to rebuild your life with clarity, resilience, and self-respect. Start your journey today. Get your copy of The Ultimate Guide to Overcoming Addiction, Steps, Tools, and Resources. Available now in ebook, paperback, and audiobook formats.